Welcome to the Architecture Corner. Get ready because today we're unpacking some really intriguing ideas about how we build software.
That's right. We're looking specifically at how to maybe bridge that gap between the agile ways we often say we work and, well, the layered architectures we actually end up building with.
Yeah, that gap can feel pretty wide sometimes. So we're diving into a specific perspective, right? Looking at making development smoother, faster, maybe more genuinely iterative.
Exactly. We're talking about a concept called vertical development today.
Hmm.
Really want to explore how it stacks up against, the more traditional ways you might be used to seeing things built.
Okay, let's slice into this then. So agile methodology, I mean, everyone talks about it, welcoming change, delivering frequently those user stories like, as a customer, I want to. That's kind of the standard playbook now, isn't
Oh,
it?
absolutely. That's the goal, right? Incremental, iterative development, to deliver value fast. But what the source material really highlights is this disconnect, a pretty significant one sometimes.
A disconnect between the theory of iteration and the reality of how we structure code, especially with those layered architectures.
Precisely. The ones that neatly separate concerns. UI, application, domain, infrastructure, persistence,
Hmm.
clean, hexagonal, onion, whatever name you give it.
Right, those neat boxes.
Yeah. And the source argues that the way we architect in those layers can sort of unconsciously pull us into developing feature by feature horizontally. It influences the process itself.
Ah, okay. So the architecture kind of dictates the workflow, pulling us away from maybe a more agile slice.
That's the idea.
Yeah.
And the source calls this the horizontal way, building layer by layer.
So what does that actually look like day to day? What's the pattern?
Well, you see it a lot. A team, or maybe just one developer, really focuses on completing, let's say, an entire architectural layer before they move up or down to the next one. It feels thorough, at the layer level.
Right. So someone might spend, I don't know, a few days just building out the entire repository for some entity, like all the possible database operations, everything they can think of.
Before anything in the application layer or the UI layers even try to call it.
Yeah.
Or maybe writing all the business rules and logic for a domain entity, completely isolated from how it's actually going to be triggered or used.
Okay, so they finish all the database stuff, then maybe they build the whole domain model piece, then the application service. And only then, maybe weeks later, do they actually try and connect it to the UI.
That's a very common flow, building horizontally across the layers.
It sounds structured. If we think about building a house, it's like finishing the entire foundation first, done.
Yeah.
Then building all the walls for the first floor, done. Then all the walls for the second floor.
Before you even think about putting in, like, the kitchen sink or making a single room actually usable.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a great analogy. You're building across the whole footprint, level by level.
But it sounds like this causes problems. What are the downsides the source calls out? The real practical headaches of this horizontal approach?
Well, the biggest one, probably the most immediate, is that a feature isn't actually usable until all those different layer pieces are connected and working together.
Right.
End to end.
Right.
So you might have this beautifully crafted, perfect repository layer, but until the application layer and the UI layer can actually use it as part of fulfilling a user's request, it delivers zero actual value.
So you're delivering components, pieces, but not working software in the agile sense.
Exactly. You've got done code, but it's not part of a done feature. And here's where it often gets really painful. As you finally start connecting those layers, especially we get towards the top, like the UI or the application services,
No?
you inevitably gain a much better understanding of what's actually needed, how the user interacts, how the data really needs to flow.
And you suddenly realize those perfect components you build down low based on your best guesses at the time,
Yeah.
They don't quite work.
Bingo. You find out the domain logic needs data structured just a bit differently than your repository provides. Or the application service needs inputs you didn't anticipate. So you end up having to go back and change code you thought was finished.
Ouch.
Code you built before you even tried to use it in a real end-to-end scenario.
That sounds like a recipe for wasted effort, or at least some really frustrating rework cycles just because assumptions were slightly off early on.
It definitely can be. And those changes tend to ripple through the layers,
Okay, so if horizontal layer-by-layer building leads to these integration problems and delays real value, what's the alternative? How do we flip the script here?
This is where the idea of vertical development comes in. It's a shift in focus. Instead of thinking about completing layers, you think about completing features, or really user stories.
Right. So you look at one specific user story and you implement only the minimum code you need, but you do it across all the relevant layers to make just that specific feature work. end to end in one go.
That's the core concept.
Yeah.
You build a thin vertical slice right through your architecture for that one piece of functionality.
Okay, back to the house analogy. Instead of floor by floor, it's
Like,
like building room by room. You put in just enough foundation, just enough first floor structure, second floor walls, wiring, plumbing, whatever it takes to make, say, the kitchen functional first.
hmm
And then you tackle the living room, adding another vertical slice.
exactly. You build the minimum viable slice to get a basic version of that feature working from the user's perspective.
Mm.
Then you iterate. You expand that slice, maybe add error handling, maybe replace a temporary mock with the real database code, maybe refactor things, but always focused on a working end-to-end slice.
Okay, I'm starting to see the appeal.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the benefits then. What are the big wins the source mentions for working vertically?
Well, the first one is pretty huge.
Right.
You basically write only the code you need. Think about it. Horizontally, you're often trying to guess, to anticipate every possible way a layer might be used in the future.
Right, trying to build the complete repository domain model.
Vertically, you just build what's required for the current feature slice you're working on. Nothing more, initially.
So less code up front, less guesswork, less code built on shaky assumptions.
Precisely. The source even talks about deliberately deferring complexity. Maybe you start with a simple in-memory data store, or use mocks for external services. You don't over-engineer a layer in isolation because you don't fully know how it needs to work within the whole feature yet.
Got it. Less code is usually good news. Less to write, less to test, less to maintain, less to potentially throw away later. What else gets easier?
Testing. Testing becomes much, much simpler. Your scope is smaller and more focused. It's an end-to-end slice for a single feature.
Ah, so it's easier to write tests that actually map directly to the code you just wrote because you have a clear goal. Does this specific feature path work?
Exactly. It lines up really well with things like PDD, test-driven development. You can write a test for the feature's behavior first,
Yeah.
and then you build just the minimum code across the layers needed to make that specific test pass.
That makes a lot of sense. A smaller, concrete target for tests. And I guess this leads right into the next benefit. Smaller, focused code reviews.
Absolutely. Your pull requests, your code submissions, they become much smaller. You're submitting the code for just one feature slice, or maybe even just one scenario within that slice,
Yeah.
not this massive chunk of an entire layer.
Yeah, nobody likes reviewing a 2,000-line pull request covering half a dozen unrelated things.
Right. And the source mentions research showing that smaller code reviews actually tend to be more effective at finding defects.
Really? That's counterintuitive, but it makes sense. Easier to wrap your head around a small change.
Totally. So you get feedback faster on a smaller chunk of code. Imagine spending 3 days building out a whole layer, submitting it, and then getting feedback that basically invalidates half of it. Been there. With vertical slices, that feedback comes much quicker on less code. It can save you days of rework.
Okay, so faster feedback, potentially higher quality reviews. And this also tackles that rework problem we mentioned earlier, reduced impedance mismatch and rework.
Yes. That friction between how different layers expect to interact or how data is represented, because you're building and integrating across the layers for a single feature slice almost immediately.
You find those mismatches right away.
Exactly. You don't build a whole persistence layer in isolation, only to find out weeks later that the application layer needs the data formatted completely differently. You discover those integration points and potential conflicts much, much sooner.
Fewer moving parts developed in isolation means fewer surprises when you connect them. You're kind of integrating constantly.
Right. The feedback on how the layers need to talk to each other is built right into the process. And one last thing. It sounds small, but it really smooths out the day-to-day. More efficient stand-ups.
Huh. How does slicing code vertically make our daily stand-up meetings better?
Well, think about the typical horizontal update. Yeah, I'm still working on the repository, or making progress on the domain logic. It's kind of vague, right?
Yeah, the classic, I'm working on, update, not super informative.
Exactly. Because the scope is so large and abstract, when you're working vertically on a specific feature slice, your update becomes much more concrete.
Oh.
Okay, today I'm implementing the happy path for creating an order, connecting the API endpoint through the command handler to the mocked database.
Ah, okay. You can instantly tell what feature is being worked on and what the specific task within that feature is. Makes blockers much clearer too, I bet.
Totally. It just makes the conversation more grounded in actual deliverable functionality.
Okay, this all sounds really good in theory. Less code, better testing, faster feedback, less rework, clearer updates. But how does this actually play out with a real feature? The source had a good example, didn't it?
Yeah, let's walk through their example. Imagine you need to build a feature for placing an online order. And let's say there are a couple of basic rules. Max 10 items per order, and a customer can't place a new order if they already have one being processed. Pretty standard stuff.
Okay, how do you tackle that vertically?
Right. Step 1. Identify the scenarios. First, you figure out the main success path, the happy path. In this case, it's a valid order, 10 items or fewer, from a customer who doesn't have another order pending. Then you list out the other cases, too many items, and existing orders processing as secondary scenarios. But you focus first on just getting that happy path working.
Nail the core success case first. Makes sense.
Yep. Step 2. Build the minimum principal scenario. Now, you write just enough code across all the necessary layers to make only that happy path function end-to-end. The source even makes a kind of radical suggestion here.
Oh.
They suggest you could even start by implementing most of this initially within the UI layer, like maybe just saving the order data temporarily as a simple JSON object right there.
Whoa, okay. Saving data in the UI, that definitely goes against the grain of strict layering.
It absolutely does. But remember the goal. Get something working end-to-end super fast for
Yeah.
that one core scenario. You're validating the vertical flow. It's definitely not the final architecture, but it gets you immediate feedback on whether the basic interaction works.
Okay, so it's like a super thin, maybe slightly messy proof of concept slice just to see the data flow end to end.
Kind of, yeah. A minimum viable slice to prove the core path. Then what?
Right. Step 3, work on abstractions. Now that you've got that basic flow working and you've probably learned a bit more about the real requirements, now you refactor. You start pulling the logic out into proper abstractions, maybe command objects, handlers, simple domain models.
Ah, okay. So this is where it starts to look more like the layered architecture we were aiming for.
Exactly. You introduce the layers properly now that you understand the interactions better. And this is where you'd add your tests too. Maybe you're still mocking the database, but you're testing the application logic, the domain rules for that happy path.
Makes sense.
And the source makes another great point here. You can defer deciding on the final data persistence model for as long as possible. Because you built the slice first, you have a much better idea of what data you actually need to store and how before you commit to, say, a specific database schema or even a database type. That's clever. So you're not locked into a database design until you've actually seen the feature work and understand its real data needs. You could start with simple storage and evolve it.
Right. Maybe you stick with JSON for a bit. Maybe you realize a document database fits better. Or maybe you eventually structure it for a relational database as the domain logic gets more complex. Flexibility. Then you start adding the other rules.
Step 4, add secondary scenarios iteratively, like the item limit and the concurrent order check.
Exactly. You tackle them one by one. Maybe you add the 10-item validation first. Then you implement the logic to check for existing orders.
And where does that new logic typically live?
Well, this is often where your domain model really starts to flesh out. That validation logic are the more than 10 items, or the state check, is this customer already ordering? That usually belongs in your order entity or maybe related value objects within the domain layer.
Okay, so the domain layer gets richer and more capable as you add each new rule or scenario slice.
Precisely. And as you add these, naturally, you'll update your persistence code if needed. And critically, you'll add new tests to cover these new scenarios and edge cases. The key thing is, each of these additions, adding the validation, adding the concurrency check, can be its own small, manageable delivery, its own pull request.
So you build the entire feature eventually, but you deliver it incrementally, slice by vertical slice, getting feedback all along the way, instead of building each layer in one huge isolated chunk.
That's the fundamental shift in thinking.
Okay, so wrapping this up then, what's the main takeaway for people listening?
I think the source really emphasizes that while, maybe not every single tiny task fits this model perfectly, this vertical slicing approach is really broadly applicable. And importantly, it aligns much more closely with the actual spirit of Agile development.
Yeah, things like welcoming change, getting that fast feedback, delivering value step by step.
Definitely. Now, it does take patience and discipline, right, to change habits, especially if you're really used to that sort of comfortable layer-first approach. But the potential payoff, smaller changes, easier reviews, quicker feedback, fewer nasty integration surprises. It seems pretty significant.
It's really just a different way to look at decomposing the work, isn't it? Focusing on the feature flow rather than the architectural boxes.
Yeah, a subtle shift in perspective, but one that seems like it could make a really big difference to the development flow, and frankly, the team's sanity.
So it really makes you think, how are you currently slicing up features? Is it horizontal, layer by layer? Or is it more vertical, feature by feature? How might trying this vertical approach change how you tackle your next piece of work?
And if you want to dive deeper, check out the description for more information and resources on what we talked about today.
Absolutely. And if you enjoyed this exploration into software architecture, make sure you subscribe for free to the Architecture Corner newsletter. That way you won't miss any of our future deep dives.